Georgia is the overwhelming #1 team, not only in the US LBM Coaches Poll, but also in this week's release of the preseason Associated Poll. Question is, are the Bulldogs really that much of a clear-cut favorite, or is this just a reflection of the national respect for Kirby Smart and what he's built in that program? Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, we discussed the preseason coaches poll last week. Well, the media poll, the AP poll, was out this week, and it seemed as if the sports writers just kind of copied the homework that was already done for them from the coaches. And as you pointed out last week, you think the coaches copied the homework that was already done by Lindy's and Athlon preseason magazines. So a lot of groupthink going around in these preseason predictions, including the top 6 teams are identical in the AP poll as what they were in the coaches poll. So in order, that's Georgia, followed by Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Alabama, and Ole Miss. And not only are the top 6 the same, I should throw in Notre Dame is also number 7 in both polls. So same top number 7 teams in both polls, but also Georgia is the runaway favorite in terms of first place votes in both of these polls. Does that surprise you at all, seeing Georgia not only #1, but just how much they were #1 by the distance that they had established over Ohio State?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at the distance between the two. I think maybe if Ohio State was a sure thing at quarterback, and it may turn out to be in really good shape at quarterback with Will Howard, because he did very well at Kansas State, but we don't know that for sure. Whereas Georgia has Carson Beck, an established Heisman candidate, had a great year in his first season as a starter, really experienced in Georgia's system because he sat behind Stetson Bennett. So that's a sure thing. Also, I think the fact that Georgia added a marquee running back in Trevor Etienne from Florida. I mean, that was a big transfer. Certainly Ohio State enhanced itself too. I thought it would be closer between Ohio State and Georgia. But it kind of goes back to what we said before with when Alabama was winning all the time. Preseason polls, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Well, you know they'll be good, whether it's Alabama and now Georgia. And we know Ohio State will be pretty good, but maybe not championship good. So we're kind of looking at track records here. And so here we go again with Georgia in what could be a very competitive SEC this year, I think, still with people siding with Georgia because of the track record and because of Kirby Smart's track record and because of the quarterback's track record.
It's interesting with Alabama, John, because it was sort of almost automatic, not quite, but it got to the point where it was nearly automatic with Alabama under Nick Saban. They were ranked preseason #1 in the AP poll 7 times during Saban's tenure, but they only won the national championship one of those 7 times. It was actually in the off years that they weren't ranked preseason #1 that they would more often win the national championship. You go back to Saban's final national championship team, the 2020 team that was so good during that pandemic year, went undefeated, had the explosive offense. Clemson was actually the preseason #1 team that year, made the playoff, but Alabama was far and away the best team. So, and then Georgia, they were ranked preseason #1 last year, did not win the national championship. The 2 previous years, when they went back to back, Alabama was ranked preseason #1 in those years. So I think oftentimes, like if you're ranked preseason #1, it's a pretty sure bet you're going to be one of the best teams in the nation. You have to go back more than a decade to find a team that was preseason #1 and just totally flopped its way out of the top 10 teams in college football in the upcoming season. However, it's far from a guarantee that you're going to go from preseason #1 to national champion. So I guess I'm wondering about Ohio State in that #2 spot and Oregon at #3. I mean, I think those teams are in a pretty good spot. They don't have, overwhelming preseason expectations. Oregon's getting a lot of hype in their first year in the Big Ten. But I do think that I don't want to say they're flying below the radar, because they are on the short list of teams that can win it all. But they're not in that front runner status. And whether coincidence or the fact that there actually is something to it, either way, that's been a pretty good spot to be the last decade plus in college football, is to be a highly ranked team coming into the year, but not the preseason number one. I'm wondering what you think about that, whether being number one versus kind of opening 2, 3, or 4 and sort of the position that puts you in.
Well, I still look at it like Georgia now with a 12-team playoff. Maybe at the end of the regular season, Georgia isn't ranked number one. Okay. But going into a playoff, I would still favor Georgia. I think, to me, if Georgia makes it to the playoff, it's in really good shape. I wouldn't bet against – I would have a really hard time. I don't know how it might unfold, but I would have a hard time betting against Georgia in the playoff and betting against Kirby Smart, as opposed to betting for, say, Ryan Day of Ohio State or Dan Lanning of Oregon. Neither Oregon nor Ohio State have excelled in the playoffs the way Georgia has it. We talk about Kirby winning those back-to-back national championships in 21 and 22, but he's one huge play away from a third national championship for the 2017 season. I mean, nobody else approaches that. And I think we go back and we look at last year. Georgia didn't get into the playoff, but if it had, I think we'd have probably both bet on Georgia.
Yeah, and I think these polls are maybe a little bit of a reflection of that. Both the coaches and the media, I think, by overwhelmingly putting Georgia in the number one position, it's an acknowledgement that even though Georgia wasn't in the playoff last year, I think the widespread thought is that they were one of the nation's 4 best teams. And the way the games fell, I think it's understandable why they weren't in the playoff, and it disproves the idea that the committee was ever putting the 4 best teams in the playoff. And I don't have any argument with Georgia not being in, but I think this preseason poll, one, points to the fact that the voters think Georgia really was one of the best teams, maybe the best team in the nation last year. And they return a lot of that talent, including Carson Beck, from last season. And then 2, I think you're also right with Kirby Smart. With the retirement of Nick Saban and Jim Harbaugh going to the NFL, that leaves just 3 active coaches in college football that have won a national championship. Mack Brown, now at North Carolina, won 1 at Texas. Dabo got 2 at Clemson, and Georgia with Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart has 2. And that's it. That is the entire list of active college football coaches that have won a national championship. There's some other guys that have gotten close. Brian Kelly got Notre Dame to the championship game, got him into the college football playoff. Ryan Day's had Ohio State in the playoff. I mean, you can run down the list. Steve Sarkisian, Kalen DeBoer just last year had playoff teams. A lot of coaches have done really good things, either at their current or past programs. But in terms of just national championships, just 3 guys. And I think this overwhelming designation of Georgia at number 1, 2 speaks to that, which you were touching on earlier. Not only does Kirby have the back-to-back on his resume, and that's in recent memory, it's not only that. I think it's the fact that no one else, other than Dabo and Mack Brown, have a national championship on the resume.
Yeah, I think coaching is a big factor in it. I think quarterback is a big factor in it. You don't just want a good quarterback, but it's the idea of having a quarterback who's proven under playoff pressure. Or I should just say pressure, because Carson Beck lost that playoff game. He didn't lose it. His team lost it, but to Alabama, and he doesn't make the playoff. But watching Carson Beck last year, I trust him in a close game in the 4th quarter when things aren't going that way. He hasn't done what Stetson Bennett did, but he's pretty clutch, I think. Would I rather have Stetson Bennett? Yeah, because he won 2 national titles. And I think that's so important to have a player, particularly in the playoffs, that can make those game-turning plays. And I believe Beck can do it, but I knew Stetson Bennett could do it. Mm-hmm. And I look at another thing about Georgia. as high as I am on Georgia, I'm not as high on Georgia. This team as I was, say, the 2022 team, when it was going for back-to-back titles. That's very hard to do. But still, when you look at that talent that Kirby had assembled there, I thought, well, if any team can do it, this one can. And I thought it might make 3 in a row as difficult as that could be. I wonder, a question I have about Georgia now is, I don't think the depth of talent is as good on this team as it was on those 21-22 teams.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing, we did a preseason All-America team through USA Today, John. I voted in that. And one thing I noticed was just how many Ohio State guys I was either penciling in on my ballot. We just did a first team. So, 11 guys on offense, 11 guys on defense. So even with that few spots, I found myself voting for Ohio State players pretty often. And when I didn't vote for them, there were a few more guys that were kind of on my just missed it list. Some of those positions, you can only vote for 2 wide receivers on your ballot, and just 5 offensive linemen, that type of thing. Those spots fill up quickly, but still, I found myself voting for a lot of Ohio State players. And like I said, even when I wasn't at certain positions, they were kind of on my just missed the cut. And I actually found myself voting for more Buckeyes than I did Georgia Bulldogs. However, the difference is Carson Beck was my preseason All-America quarterback. And that's where he finished in the USA Today voting. He is the first team preseason All-America quarterback. And I think that is the kind of distinguishing factor, as you've pointed out already, between Georgia and Ohio State. Depth chart to depth chart, position to position, I think I might like Ohio State better. Quarterback, I like Georgia's situation. And that's what makes Oregon, though, interesting, because Oregon has the Oklahoma transfer, Dylan Gabriel, and we know how good he is. Now, he's adjusting to a different conference as well, but I really don't think it's going to be that much of a transition for Dylan Gabriel, who just smashed it last season at Oklahoma, beat Texas. I don't think it's going to be much of a transition for him to step into the Big Ten with that Oregon offense. I think Dylan Gabriel has proven himself enough. I trust him quite a bit. So, yeah, overall depth chart, I might like Ohio State's the best. When you factor in the quarterbacks, I might like Georgia and Oregon, their chances. And I guess the totality of it, depth chart plus quarterback, I think that's what makes Georgia the overall favorite.
As much college football as I watch, and I know you watch a lot too, but a regular season kind of becomes a blur to me. I really have a hard time remembering who did what to whom. But a game that really stuck out from last season, an early, October game, was the Red River rivalry. I'll be politically correct there, not refer to it as a shootout. Was Dylan Gabriel's last-minute drive for Oklahoma. That was like a championship drive. If you can do that in that game, you can do it in a playoff game. You can do it in a national championship game. I really like Dylan Gabriel. He's probably not as good of a pro prospect as some other guys. As a pro prospect, I'd probably take Carson Beck over him. But as a college quarterback, I so like him. I love the way he has the ability, I think, as Stetson Bennett did at Georgia, to raise his game when it matters most, and he can make plays on the run. He doesn't have to throw it. He's not a runner as a quarterback, but he can make great runs when needed. He can, you got a 3rd and 8. Dylan Gabriel get that for you with his legs. So that is a huge plus to me for Oregon, and that's why I think it makes it a very dangerous team. I'm curious to how this conference transfer will work for Oregon, and how these matchups will unfold. But I know what Dylan Gabriel can do, and I know Oregon has been recruiting well. So I'm probably like Oregon's chances more this season, maybe than I ever have.
I was looking at some national championship odds recently, John, and they sort of match the preseason polls here. Georgia's the front runner by the odds makers to win the national championship, followed by Ohio State, followed by Oregon's kind of a distant third behind Ohio State. Ohio State has closer odds to Georgia than its odds are to Oregon. So two clear-cut favorites. Georgia won by the odds makers, followed by Ohio State. I'm wondering, though, if I took Georgia out of the picture and I offered you Ohio State and Oregon, who would be your pick to win the national championship? Or I guess you can reject both of them and reach for somebody else.
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, Ohio State, there's tremendous talent there. There has been for a long time. And I don't know about Ryan Day. I don't look at Ryan Day as a detriment to that program's chances of winning a championship. He's come close. And other coaches come close before they finally win one. So that could work its way with him. That would be a tough call, but I'd probably go with Ohio State's just kind of because of its long-standing image.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State went in and got Alabama's an All-American safety in Caleb Downs as a transfer. That's pretty heavy hitting there.
Yeah, they're loaded on defense, on offense. They got two All-America caliber running backs and Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. They got wide receiver talent. Offensive line is going to be fine. I mean, really the only question about Ohio State, well, maybe it's two. You hit on one, quarterback. Will Howard is good at Kansas State. Can he be just as good at Ohio State? Probably. We'll wait and see. And two, I think until Ryan Day wins one, there are going to be some doubters that say, he folds in the big games. Well, Harbaugh, and he lost to Kirby in a playoff game. Well, Jim Harbaugh's out of the picture now, so that takes care of one of those situations. And in a 12-team playoff, maybe Ohio State won't have to beat Georgia. Perhaps someone else could take care of that.
Well,
and looking at, go ahead, John.
Well, no, I'm just thinking, look at the way he lost to Georgia. That wasn't, by no stretch of the imagination, was that a collapse under playoff pressure. Ohio State played a great game. It just came down to one of those game-ending field goals. I don't disparage Ohio State or Ryan Day for that performance. I thought it played a great Georgia team toe-to-toe and really had it on the ropes. And I looked at Georgia as winning that game as opposed to Ohio State losing it. So
when we look at these polls, John, it really is. I mean, they're almost identical. And we see that to a certain degree year over year, but this one even more than usual. I mean, you could almost lay the AP poll on top of the coaches poll and and have it align perfectly. But in each poll, 9 SEC teams are ranked. I think we know. I think our listeners know them, but let's run through them anyway. There's Georgia, there's Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss. There's Missouri, LSU, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas A&M. And they're ranked almost in the same spot in each of these polls. It ranges from number 1 Georgia to number 20 Texas A&M in each poll. And I was doing some interesting calculations this week, John. So with 9 ranked teams, I was trying to figure out the way the schedules fall, how many of these 9 ranked SEC teams could finish the season with 2 losses or fewer. Because I think we're in agreement of if you're 10-2 or better from the SEC, you're a strong contender for the playoffs. So I thought, how many of these 9, just mathematically, could it get to the point where they were 10-2 or better? And actually, now this is far-fetched, I will admit, but you can make it match up to where all 9 could finish 10-2 or better. Now that would require that would require Georgia to lose 2 games. And I don't think Georgia is going to lose 2 games, certainly not before the playoff. But if Georgia lost 2, and if you assign those wins to a couple teams on its schedule, I got it matched up to where all 9 teams could finish 10-2 or better. Now, again, I don't think that's going to happen. But what could happen, I think, is that of these 9, maybe 6 could finish 10-2 and better, or consistently saying that I think 5 is a realistic playoff number for the SEC. I think they get 5 teams in without having to stretch the imagination too much. But what if this scenario happens where, let's say, the SEC has 6 10-2 teams? Now, I know you can't see the chessboard of what's happening in other conferences, but what would be kind of your gut reaction to that? Do you think all 6 SEC teams would get in at 10-2 or better, or do you think that 5 is probably the cap, and one of those 10-2 teams, maybe whichever one had the late season loss or the one with the weakest strength of schedule, do you think a 10-2 team from the SEC would be left out?
Yeah, I think 5 is tops. And I don't think you'll have, it's possible, but I don't think you'll have 6 10-2 teams. Because when I look at these schedules and I see how a team can go 10-2, yeah, you can get 6 teams that way, but the problem is there are always some upsets, inexplicable upsets that nobody sees coming, because this is still a tough league. And the midsection of the SEC, or even the bottom half of this league, you've got some teams that could pull off an upset and beat a team that's with playoff aspirations. We've seen it before. So I don't think it would come down to that. But if it did, and that would be so tough to be a 10-2 SEC team. You got good strength of schedule and left out. But
yeah, I think, I don't know how they'd cut it. It might, like I said, it would probably depend in certain part on what happened in other conferences. You know, does the Big 12 and the ACC, do they have a clear number 2 team that could claim a second bid for those conferences? If they do, then I think you could see the SEC's number 6 team get cut. But if those conferences are far and away a 1-bid league, and there's not really a great debate for a number 2 team, then maybe I could see the SEC getting 6. But if Notre Dame gets in, that reduces a bid. So it really is a tough avenue to get more than 5. I think getting 5 is pretty realistic for the SEC. Getting 6 would take a lot of help, I think, in other conferences. And I think, strength of schedule, some teams could leave themselves a little bit vulnerable. I look at Missouri. Missouri plays 3 teams that are ranked in the preseason top 25. That's Texas A&M. They play them in early October. They play Alabama in late October. They play Oklahoma in November. So I'm wondering if Missouri would leave itself vulnerable even at 10-2. Let's say they beat Texas A&M on October 5th, but then later in the year they lose to Alabama. They lose to Oklahoma. That would be, 2 losses in their final 5 games, and they're sitting there at 10-2. Best win on their resume is an October 5th victory at Texas A&M. If it's not a crowded field, I think Missouri's fine at 10-2. But if it starts to get crowded, I wonder about Missouri's strength of schedule at 10-2, and even to a certain degree, Ole Miss as well. Ole Miss has 3 marquee games on this schedule. They are at LSU, they host Oklahoma, and they host Georgia. What happens if Ole Miss loses to LSU, loses to Georgia, and is hanging its hat on 10-2 with a win over Oklahoma? I think they're in pretty good shape. But if the field gets especially crowded, I could see them being a little bit more bold on strength of schedule as well. Those are a couple of the teams that I wonder, if it got too crowded in that list of at-large contenders, would Missouri or Ole Miss's schedule hold up?
That's another reason I think these non-conference games are so important. And what teams need to do, there's a lot of cheering that needs to go on here. When you look at a game, for example, if Texas A&M can beat Notre Dame, and then Notre Dame goes on and has a really good season, say loses one more game, it's 10-2. A&M sitting there with a victory over a 10-2 team, ostensibly a playoff contender. That looks really good for A&M. LSU plays Southern California in Las Vegas. It not only needs to beat Southern California, it needs to hope USC keeps winning after that. Doesn't want it to win too much, but winning because it doesn't want it to make the playoff, but it wants it to be just on the outside so it becomes a good win. I look at Tennessee's schedule. Tennessee's another one of these teams. Its schedule is accommodating, but if it came down to strength of schedule in the SEC, it wouldn't be as good as some others. So an early season game against NC State, to me, would be really meaningful for Tennessee. Best case scenario, win convincingly, and then hope that NC State just wins a bunch of games. I've looked at NC State's schedule. Of all the top 25 teams preseason, it's got one of the easiest schedules, I think. It doesn't play Miami or Florida State in the ACC. It doesn't play Notre Dame. It plays at Clemson. It could lose to Tennessee and lose to Clemson and be 10-2. That would look really good for Tennessee. Only non-conference game of any substance. It won that against a 10-2 team. That's one of the things this playoff, 12-team playoff does to me. It makes you more interested in other teams and makes more games matter, I think. Because you know, a lot of times when you're on a selection committee, I would think it's kind of like we vote in the top 25 poll sometimes for the AP. You're not just looking for who's the best team. You're looking for reasons to break ties, for reasons to eliminate teams. Well, look what this team, it had a bad loss here, or its schedule wasn't good. So you want to cover your bases in that regard. I think it makes for a tremendously compelling season with all these games having impact and with all these non-conference games. Texas and Michigan, I think Michigan's an overrated team. It's in the top 10 in all preseason polls I've seen. I think it's overrated. It lost a lot, and I'm skeptical always of a new coach, particularly when he's been promoted from within. So, but what if Michigan at home could beat Texas? Boy, that turns things around for Michigan. It's got that win over Texas. Also, in Texas's case, though, it needs to beat Michigan and then hope that Michigan does well the rest of the year. So a lot of cheerleading going on.
Yeah, and it doesn't just help the team that beats that non-conference opponent. It can help others within the conference as well. As you were mentioning that Texas A&M Notre Dame scenario, and I'm thinking about a 10-2 Missouri team that's on the bubble. And the way I laid it out, Missouri beats Texas A&M in early October, loses to Alabama and Oklahoma. They're 10-2. They're on the bubble. If they beat Texas A&M and A&M has a win over Notre Dame, you can't put Notre Dame in the playoff above Missouri.
Well, it is Notre Dame.
Well, okay, let me rephrase. You can't fairly put Notre Dame into the playoff above Missouri in that scenario. So there are some trickle-down effects here as well. I mean, I think you're right. If you have what you think is a playoff contending team in the SEC, these non-conference games are huge, whether it involves your team or not. You know, even if you're a Texas Longhorn fan, I'm sorry, you got to stomach your dislike of the Aggies and pull for Texas A&M against Notre Dame in week 1, because it's shooting yourself in the foot if you're rooting for Notre Dame in that game, and it could backfire on you if your team is on the bubble. And there are numerous examples of that throughout this conference. You touched on another one, LSU Southern Cal. I mean, I think the Big Ten could be capped at about 3 or 4 playoff bids. You mentioned you think Michigan's a bit overrated. I agree. We think Ohio State and Oregon are playoff teams. I think Penn State is probably going to be a playoff team. I know you look at them sort of as a bubble team, but then you have Michigan, and then you got to go all the way to Southern Cal. If LSU beats Southern Cal in week 1, that is a haymaker on Southern Cal's playoff chances. And so that already reduces, the Big Ten's total number of bids that they could get. Then if Michigan fizzles, Big Ten's probably going to be capped at a maximum of 3 bids. That's good for the SEC and their quest to get, 5+ teams into the playoffs. So you're right, John. These non-conference games, whether it involves your team or not, you have every reason to have that conference pride on the line. Sometimes I roll my eyes about this SEC idea and where you puff out your chest if another team from the conference wins a national championship, and it's like your team went 6-6, but hey, Alabama won another one, or Georgia wins a title, so you start chanting SEC. It's like, does that really make you feel better? You went 6-6. But I don't roll my eyes at now having conference pride in some of these non-conference games, because it didn't matter that much in a 4-team playoff. If your team didn't go, say, 12-1 or have Alabama on the front of the jersey, you weren't getting in the playoff. But now all this other stuff matters so much more to your playoff resume and your strength of schedule and how your conference is perceived. And those non-conference games, starting in week 1, they're going to have some major weight. And the third one, you mentioned LSU, USC, Notre Dame, Texas A&M's week 1. Another big one in week 1 is Clemson in Atlanta against Georgia. Clemson's supposedly one of the 2 best teams in the ACC. If Georgia steamrolls them, that is an early blow to the idea of the ACC getting 2 teams into the playoff. And if the ACC is a 1-bid league, once again, that's good news. Not just for Georgia, but that's good news for the SEC's 4th and 5th and 6th best team that are going to be trying to get those at-large bids.
Oh, yeah. I think also, I look at other games. You bring up Penn State. Some games that you don't think of as having playoff implications, but could. I think Penn State opens the season in Morgantown against West Virginia. West Virginia is a pretty good team this year. That can be a very hostile environment. I could see an upset. And imagine if Penn State lost to West Virginia. It's not impossible. If Penn State lost that game, on the same weekend, if Penn State lost and Southern California lost to LSU, and then Michigan loses to Texas, there's no guarantee that the Big Ten's going to get 3 teams in there. It might get 2. Because I don't know below those teams who would I think is going to be a playoff contender in the Big Ten. There's a gap, and so a game like that you think, yeah, Penn State will be favored, but I don't think it'll be an overwhelming favorite at West Virginia. I really don't. So I just think there are a lot of games that will be like that. I wonder, I don't have a schedule in front of me. You might know. Missouri, does it play Kansas or Kansas State non-conference?
No, it's a quote-unquote marquee non-conference game is against Boston College.
That's what I thought, and that's what I feared for Missouri. I don't know if a win over BC moves the needle. Like there again, though, Missouri's got to suddenly begin championing Boston College's chances for success, because Boston College goes 7-5, 6-6. It's got no good wins outside the conference. And I wonder if that will factor into the committee's thinking too. The selection committee rewards teams in basketball for stepping out of the conference and scheduling difficult opponents. I wonder if it would do the same in football, where sure, the SEC creates a demanding conference schedule, but it will give extra credit, I guess, for a school that goes out of its way to say schedule a Michigan or a Southern California, or on the other hand, maybe downgrades an opponent, a team that says, well, we'll get Boston College as our Power 4 opponent. I wonder if that could count against you. Because if you get a lot of these SEC teams tied for a playoff berth, you're going to really get into minutia to try and determine who's better and who gets left, who's in and who's out, I think.
Yeah, that is going to be worth monitoring here in the first couple of years of this expanded playoff, because it didn't really matter in the old format. It's like I said, if you went 13-0, unless your name was Florida State in 2023, you were in. If you were 12-1 in a conference championship, you had a great chance of being in. But, you know, it really didn't go that deep. Now there's going to be so many more teams in contention, and I think stuff like non-conference strength of schedule will have to be looked at in those scenarios where you're deciding between, say, the final 10-2 teams. You know, I mean, the committee might have to make a hard call between, for the final spot between two Power 4 teams that went 10-2. The way I see it, the one with the better strength of schedule probably should be the one to get that spot. Let's close with this, John. The 9 SEC teams are ranked. There were 3 in the coaches poll that were receiving votes but were unranked. It was Auburn, Kentucky, and Florida. And then in the AP poll, Kentucky and Auburn got votes, but Florida did not. But let's add Florida into the mix. Makes the conversation more interesting. If one of those 3 that are not starting ranked in the top 25, but are vote getters, if one of those 3 were to finish the season in the top 25, who do you think is the most likely candidate? Auburn, Kentucky, or Florida?
Well, I look at Florida's schedule and eliminate it. There's just no way. It could have a really good team and go 7-5. Kentucky. I
see you shaking your. You're not even going to make an attempt to talk yourself into it, are you?
No, I do think Brock Vandiger, if the Georgia transfer, could be pretty good at quarterback. But Auburn is one of those teams, one of those programs, and Hugh Freeze is one of those coaches. He's done pretty well, and you know, you look at him at Ole Miss. He went 10-2. There was some hanky-panky going on there, but he beat Nick Saban twice. He won 2 big games against Alabama at Ole Miss. Not everybody can do that. And Auburn's a team, it's history. When Auburn does well, it can do really well. And I just think of it's a team with a really great home field advantage. In a close game, that could put it over its top. Don't ask me how it lost at home to New Mexico State last year? I think it was 31-10, just an awful loss. So it doesn't always work out that way. But of those 3 programs, I still kind of like Auburn more. I guess I like Hugh Freeze more than Billy Napier or Mark Stoops as a coach too.
Yeah, I think I would lean Auburn as well. Auburn, it's still got a pretty tough schedule with Alabama and Georgia on it, but it's not maybe quite as tough as what Auburn is accustomed to. There's no LSU on the schedule this year. I think that favors Auburn. And there's no Ole Miss on the schedule this year either. If there's a year you want to miss Ole Miss, this is definitely the year you do not want to play the Rebels. So that breaks a little bit in Auburn's favor. That they play 5 teams ranked in the preseason top 25, so still a pretty tough schedule. But I don't think it's inconceivable to think Auburn could go 9-3 this year, or even 8-4. You might snag a spot at the end of the top 25 if you win your bowl game. I think Auburn's roster year over year is definitely better. Hugh Freeze upgraded at wide receiver in a major way. He got Keandre Lambert-Smith, who is Penn State's top receiver. He transferred to Auburn. Robert Lewis, who was one of the best pass catchers in the group of 5 last year at your school, Georgia State. Know how much you love Georgia State. He transferred from Georgia State to Auburn. And then Cam Coleman, the 5-star wide receiver, that signed with Auburn. He'll probably be a true freshman playing a lot of snaps. So they upgraded at wide receiver, which they desperately needed to do. You know Auburn's going to have running backs led by Jarquez Hunter, but Auburn always has running backs. They're always having talent in the front seven. I think for me, the questions with Auburn remain. Is the offensive line going to be anything better than average? It was average last year at best. To me, on paper, it kind of looks average again. And then at quarterback, the upgrades at wide receiver should help, but I kind of think we know what Peyton Thorne is at this point in his career. He's a fifth-year senior. He's got a lot of starts, both at Michigan State and Auburn. He can run it some, and you could do worse than Peyton Thorne at the position. You could also do a lot better at the position than Peyton Thorne. And I just think there's probably a ceiling for how much a couple better wide receivers can upgrade your quarterback. Should be a little bit better with more talent wide receiver, but I do think there's a ceiling on that. But if I were to look at one of these three teams as who's the likeliest to end up in the top 25, I think it's probably Auburn. And I think those upgrades at wide receiver probably influence my vote on that.
If we back up another year, when you're getting transfer quarterbacks instead of Peyton Thorne, if Auburn could have, well, let's say outbid Florida for Graham Mertz, it didn't seem like a large, bold-faced headline. Florida gets Graham Mertz from Wisconsin. I kind of shrugged when I heard the news, but guy completed over 70% of his passes. He was better than I thought he would be. Much better, really. And if you put him at Auburn with that group of receivers, I don't know. Auburn, I know his offensive line still might be an issue, but that might have been enough to have Auburn, not others receiving votes, but in the top, right there at the bottom of the top 25.
I agree, John. Okay, that's it for another edition of the preseason polls version of the podcast. We got both polls behind us now. That means the games are getting very, very close. It'll be a couple weeks now, and we will have the season openers upon us. John and I will stay with you throughout the preseason leading up to week one. And thanks for listening to us here on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.